Let's talk about watercolor paper. There are several things you need to know about paper, watercolor paper, before you run out and purchase it. If you haven't already purchased it, if you have, I hope you can exchange it if you need to. First of all, I want to tell you what not to buy for watercolor class. Don't buy a watercolor tablet like this tablet. This is a small watercolor tablet, 11 by 15 inches. It's a little bit smaller than what we're going to be doing most of our paintings on anyway. But there are several issues with this type of a tablet. One is the paper is, and the foremost issue is the paper is a wood-based paper, based out of wood fiber. And a wood fiber paper does not have the same microscopic makeup. It holds together differently. It doesn't last as long. It is going to yellow very quickly. Case in point, this is an older tablet, which is kind of nice. Look at how yellow that is compared to a new sheet of Arches paper. Now, this paper is probably at least 10 years old, could be 20, could be 30 years old. But if it's not a acid-free paper, it's going to start yellowing within a few years. And if it's a wood-based paper, wood fiber paper, that acid has not been removed from, it'll start yellowing right away. Think about you've been on vacation for a week and you've forgot to tell the newspaper boy to not deliver your newspapers. You can tell at a glance when you drive back into your driveway which of those newspapers were thrown a week ago and which ones were thrown yesterday, because of how yellow they become. That's in 1 week. So you can imagine what's going to happen to paper over decades or hundreds of years or millennia if there's acid in it. So it's going to yellow. Another issue with any watercolor paper, even a good 100% rag or 100% cotton paper, is the surface it comes in contact with. Case in point, here's the last page of this, and look how yellow it is compared to the page right in front of it. That is, or even the other side of the same page. That is because that paper has been in contact with this backing, which is high acid content. No attempt to remove the acid from this, probably no attempt to remove the acid even from this paper. But even if there had been, if the acid had been removed from the paper and it wasn't removed from this backing, then it's going to leach out into the paper and yellow it. So that's an issue. Another issue with the machine-made papers and the wood fiber, wood pulp papers is the texture of it. And this texture is a very predictable, repetitive texture. You probably can't see it on the camera, but it is a texture that it just looks cheap. I brought that up closer to the camera, hoping the focus would show it a little bit, but rather doubt that it will. So you have some texture problems. You have how it handles the water is poor compared to a good cotton-based paper. The pigment wants to float on the surface. It doesn't want to soak into the paper, or it soaks in too much. Multiple problems. And so you might be thinking, well, I'll just buy the less expensive watercolor paper and a tablet to do my practicing with, and then when I get ready to do my assignment paintings, I'll switch over to the good paper. Well, the problem with that thinking is you're having to relearn how to use it. All this practicing you've been doing to learn how the paper responds to water, how it responds to brushes, how it dries or not, you just throwing it out the window. And you're starting over from scratch. So you want to practice on the same paper you're doing your final type of painting on. So we're going to put away this watercolor tablet and talk about what you do want to buy. You want to purchase full sheets of Arches watercolor paper. This is a full sheet. The standard size is 22 by 30 inches. I really wish that they had standardized it at a golden rectangle, but they didn't. It's 22 by 30 inches. Most of the paintings you're going to do this semester are going to be on half sheets. So you're going to mark the center point, use the large heavy rulers upstairs to hold it down, and tear the sheets into two. You can cut them on a paper cutter with your X-Acto knife or a utility knife if you want, but traditionally we like to tear the watercolor paper into sheets. That gives you a sort of a deckled edge on the other two edges. So what's a deckled edge? Well, the two longer sides of this full sheet of paper have a true deckled edge. You can see where it's thinner around the edges. A deckled edge is a desirable aesthetic quality of the paper. It's also indicates that this is a quality mold-made or handmade paper. Those are two different things, by the way. We'll address that probably in class, the difference between mold-made and handmade. Handmade is actually mold-made, but anyway, the deckled edge. And the other ends, the shorter ends out here, have a torn edge, and it's torn in the factory into these 22 by 30 inch sheets. A good quality watercolor paper is going to have a watermark on it, and I'm going to show you the watermark on this. Is arch paper. It looks like arches, and I will alternate between arch and arches because I don't know any better. But hold this light up. There is the watermark. Hopefully you can see that in the camera. A material has been stitched into the fiber, the screen, that is dipped into the paper slurry, and it creates a thinner paper here in the corner, and that is a watermark. It has Arche, France, has a infinity symbol there, and then a physical stamp also that you probably can't see. You can also see the light coming through that deckled edge because, again, it's thinner. I went to an art conference one time, and a archival expert was talking to us about paper and paper quality, and he had a piece of full sheet of paper. I don't remember which company. I believe it might have been Fabriano. Had created a sheet of paper with a watermark of the Mona Lisa. They had stitched into the fabric thickened thin areas that caused the paper to be thicker and thinner, and when you held it up to light, you had an image of the Mona Lisa. It's pretty cool. Well, so this is a full sheet of 140-pound Arche paper. That's what you want to buy. You're probably going to need at least 6 of these. Full sheet, 140-pound, cold press. There are 3 surfaces that you can purchase with watercolor paper: hot press, cold press, and rough. You're going to want cold press for probably everything you do. You might want to buy 1 sheet of hot press so you can just have the experience. So the hot press is very smooth. This is actually a 90-pound sheet. It's much thinner. This would be really nice for pen and ink work or extremely fine detail work. Hot press paper, and by the way, this also has a watermark here in the corner. This has been torn down to a rather small sheet. This originally was 22 by 30 inches. Hot press paper is smooth, like the surface of an apple. Well, not quite that shiny or that slick, but it is smooth. There's really no texture to it. That's why it works really good for something like pen and ink, where you don't want the bumps in the paper. Hot press paper behaves quite differently than cold press paper, and I found out the hard way on a large painting that I did. In fact, it's just over my head behind me, and I'll share that story with you in class. It shows brush strokes in large flat wash areas. The brushwork shows up. It's hard to hide your brushwork, and that can be a good thing, and it can be a really bad thing. So you need to know that. The hot press paper is unforgiving relative to brush strokes showing up. It's because I think the pigment is soaking into the paper, and so you can't move it around on the surface as easily. The big advantage of hot press paper is you can lift color out, and then we do that to highlight areas. We want to take some of the pigment off the surface, and even after a watercolor is dry, even after it's dried for 100 years, you can put a brush stroke of water down and blot it with a paper towel, or preferably a cotton rag, and you can lift the pigment off. It's always water soluble. Watercolor is always water soluble. And so lifting out becomes a new tool, and I'll share more with you later on that. So hot press paper, don't recommend it for our purposes. So we're back to this full sheet of 140-pound paper. What do I mean 140 pound? Well, the weight of the paper is how much one ream weighs. And this is 22 by 30 inch paper, so it is my understanding if I have 500 sheets, that's probably a stack about yay tall, maybe taller, yeah, it would be taller than that, of 500 sheets of 22 inch by 30 inch paper, 140 pound paper. Those 500 sheets are going to weigh 140 pounds. That's the weight of the paper. So this has quite a bit of flexibility. It has a certain sound to it. It's sufficiently heavyweight for our half-sheet paintings, most of what we're going to do. It will wrinkle and buckle some as you're painting. I'm going to talk a little bit with you later about stretching watercolor paper. You can stretch it so it'll dry flat. There's YouTube videos on how to stretch watercolor paper, and like I said, I'll talk with you more about it. But you probably won't need to stretch your watercolor paper. If it does wrinkle and you need it to lie flat after you're finished painting, you can moisten the back side of it, being careful not to get the moisture over under the front. Put a piece of rag content paper over it, put a big piece of plywood on top of that, put a bunch of books on it, and let it dry overnight, and it will dry flat. I've done that often. So 140 pound, about a dozen sheets of 140 pound. You will need one sheet of 300 pound paper. Even sounds different. It's much stiffer paper. All of the full sheet paintings I do are 300 pound cold press or hot press paper. Even if I'm painting on smaller pieces, half sheet or a quarter sheet, I like to use 300 pound because it's substantive. It's not as fragile. It would withstand somebody bumping it accidentally better than a 140 pound. But as far as the archival quality of it, taking reasonable care, there's not going to be a difference. I just like the stiffness of it. This is also cold press paper. The texture, and by the way, I talked about the texture of the hot press paper being smooth, think like an apple peel, think orange peel with cold press paper. It has a little bit of a bumpy texture, kind of like the outside of an orange. The third type of paper is called rough, and it just has a more pronounced texture to it. You will easily find cold press paper for sale in art supply stores and online. You will find some hot press paper at those locations. It's a little harder to always find the rough paper. It's not used as widely. So why do you want the texture? Well, you want the texture because a lot of times you want the white sparkle of the paper to show through. So a quick brush stroke over this, and it's not going to go down into all the crevices. It's going to show that texture, little white specks. A video I have that I sometimes share with students, the author of that talks about letting the white of the paper speak, and more about that later. So you'll need one sheet of 300 pound because there's one painting. It will be due the week before we leave for Thanksgiving break, because this semester, for future classes, if I'm still using this video, we will be dismissing classes for the rest of the semester as far as meeting on campus with Thanksgiving break. So this painting will be due that week. All other semesters, this will be due during dead week, that last week of the semester. So one sheet of 300 pound Arches paper. So you're going to be working with paper this size, probably just like this one, except this has got a little extra tear in it that you don't want. This happens to have the watermark down here, as if I was going to use this on a vertical format like this. So the watermark's down here. You probably want to pay a little attention to where that watermark is relative to how it'll look on your final painting. For instance, this watermark is up here in this corner, or down here in this corner. So if you did a painting, you've got this wonderful blue sky, and you happen to be painting with the watermark up here, it may look a little funny to have that watermark visible in the top of your sky. It makes it a little, and upside down, make a little more sense to have it down here. Most people aren't going to pay attention to the watermark, but it is going to be visible unless you mat it out, cover it up with the matting. So 140 pound cold press watercolor paper, 22 by 30 inch sheets. Arches is a good brand. French paper, Fabriano. An Italian paper is an excellent paper. Aquarelle, which I think is a subsidiary of one of the others, I'm not sure. I've used it before. It's a very good paper. These will come in a natural white color, and they will come in a bright white, which is probably been bleached, a little whiter color, so you're going to see those distinctions. One more thing I need to mention to you. It's a paper that I don't want you to buy, so I'm going to do a little bit of negative PR for a company. A student bought this sheet for her full sheet watercolor painting a few years back, or 2 summers ago actually, and she started painting on it. She invested some time drawing the building in the distance and this grain bin, and she had moistened the paper and started this sky, and it just wasn't behaving the way she was used to watercolor paper behaving. She bought it at Hobby Lobby, and it was for sale in the same racks where you bought the Arches paper, 300 pound cold press. And so she was buying 300 pound cold press, not realizing, not reading the watermark, which is down here. It says, in fact, it's not even a watermark, it's just a stamp. It says Canson, C-A-N-S-O-N. And she finally had to give up. She had just quit painting. The pigment was soaking through the paper. Shouldn't be doing that. It was not behaving with her brush the way she was used to it behaving. And so she just stopped. She said, I can't paint on this. It's not working. And I suggested that she take it back to Hobby Lobby and they ask for a refund. And then on second thought, I said, no, don't bother with that. Let me buy it from you as a negative example for my future classes. So I would remember to tell students, since we now have a Hobby Lobby here in town, don't buy Canson watercolor paper. I believe you're wasting your money and you'll be wasting your time. I've done a little bit of poking around on the internet, and I found some good reviews, and I found some really bad reviews on this watercolor paper. But anyway, I wouldn't buy it if I were you. Well, that is all I'm going to share for now about your paper. But paper is an extremely important aspect of what you're doing, and it impacts the archival quality of your work. Archival. You can look the word up. I've addressed it a little bit in some information on Canvas. How long is your watercolor painting going to last? Well, if you buy decent quality paints, not Walmart brand, off-brand of paints, but a good artist, professional artist, or a good student quality of paint, and you work on rag paper. By the way, I don't know that if I said this earlier on, rag simply means 100% cotton. We want to work when painting on cotton or linen, but in watercolor it's usually cotton that we're working with or working on. If you purchase 100% cotton paper, your paintings are going to be around for your children to inherit, for your grandchildren to inherit from your children, and your great, great, great grandchildren, long after you and I are gone. There will be people, if you're not rich and famous or collected in the art museums, there will still be people who know of you, who you were by name, because you're a family member. And they will have a family heirloom literally hundreds of years from now if you use good quality paper. So that in and of itself, no matter how good of an artist you are, no matter how much you sell paintings for or not, it's good to know that your paintings are going to be around for a long, long time. Ars longa, viva brevis. Life is short, art is long. Or art is long, life is short. Good quality paper guarantees that. Have a good day.